I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. If you're looking for an introduction to Eastern Native American societies and their interactions with colonial settlers, you should be sure to check out Julie Fisher and David Silverman's Ninigrit, Sachem of the Nyantics and Narragansetts. The Nyantic and Narragansett Indians live in the area we now know as Rhode Island, and Ninigrit served as their sachem from the mid-1630s through the mid-1670s. In fact, he was the most influential New England Indian leader of his time. As Fisher and Silverman argue in their book, he was a cross-cultural power broker who stood as the key to the balance of power in both Indian colonial and intertribal relations. Plus, Ninigrit lived a fascinating life. By forming alliances with powerful peoples such as the Mohawks of the Five Nation Indians or the Puckmatucks of the Connecticut River Valley, Ninigrit established the Narragansett peoples as a major regional power who stood at the center of almost every major development involving southern New England Indians, like the Pequot War and King Philip's War. Reviewers have praised Ninigrit, Sachem of the Nyantics and Narragansetts as an excellent study of southern New England's politics and diplomacy, and as a must-read for anyone interested in colonial and Native American history. Presently, this book is available in hardcover, but Cornell University Press is now taking pre-orders for a paperback version that will release in April. Be sure to visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell for more information about this book, and be sure to use your discount code of 09BFW to lock in your 30% discount.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 119 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. On June 7, 1776, Continental Congressman Richard Henry Lee of Virginia resolved that these United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. After adopting this resolution, the Second Continental Congress formed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. And the declaration that Thomas Jefferson, his fellow committee members, and the Second Continental Congress drafted stands as one of the founding documents of the United States because it declares the nation's independence from Great Britain. But did the Declaration of Independence do more than just unmake the British Empire by declaring 13 of its North American colonies free and independent? Yale historian Steve Pincus thinks so. He argues that the last paragraph of the Declaration lays out a blueprint for a government, and not the smaller, more local government that we learned about in school either, an activist government. So today, Steve is going to take us through the Declaration of Independence and the context in which the Second Continental Congress drafted it in, so that we can better understand the Declaration of Independence and all that it achieved. During our investigation, Steve reveals details about the English Revolution of 1688-89, how ideas that developed during and after the English Revolution informed British policies about its North American colonies and the American Revolution, and how the Declaration of Independence contains the founders' blueprint for an activist government. But first, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for sharing Ben Franklin's World with your friends and family. Growing a podcast is hard to do. In fact, when Ben Franklin's World launched, it launched to 36 downloads. That's right. In its first month, October 2014, all it received was 36 downloads. And yet, over the past 2 months, Ben Franklin's World has received over 100,000 downloads. That's right. In December 2016, Ben Franklin's World had more than 100,000 downloads in that month. And now in this month, January 2017, which hasn't even ended yet, the podcast has also surpassed 100,000 downloads. This is just so amazing, and it's all because of you. And I'm just so really grateful that you've taken the time to share the show with others, because you're really helping me and our guest historians share our passion about history with others. And as you know, history is just so important to who we are. It explains who we are and how we came to be who we are, and you're helping us get that message out there. And I'm really, really grateful for that. Thank you. Now, are you ready for our new exploration of the Declaration of Independence? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is the Bradford Durfee Professor of History at Yale University and the co-director of the Yale Center for Historical Inquiry and Social Sciences. His research interests include British Atlantic and European history during the 17th and 18th centuries, and he's the author of 3 books, including, most recently, The Heart of the Declaration, The Founder's Case for an Activist Government. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Steve Pincus.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, in his book, The Heart of the Declaration, Steve contends that if we're to understand the Declaration of Independence and what it achieved, we must look at it within the larger historical context of the English Revolution of 1688-89. Steve, would you help us better understand this context? Would you provide us with an overview of the English Revolution, sometimes known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89?
Right. The Revolution of 1688-89 has been one of the most misunderstood and underappreciated events in English history. The standard story was that it was an unrevolutionary revolution, that James II had been an un-English king because he was Catholic and because of the policies that he pursued, and so the English, just in a sensible move, got together and invited James II to leave the kingdom. In fact, one of the claims that I make in a book I published a while ago was that it was the first modern revolution, and it was a real struggle between 2 competing conceptions of what a modern state should look like. And the revolutionaries fundamentally transformed England in a variety of ways. They turned English foreign policy from an anti-Dutch to an anti-French direction. They famously developed arguments for religious toleration and passed the Act of Toleration. But most importantly, for our purposes, there was a revolution in political economy, a move away from conceiving of the power of the state as deriving from landed wealth and away from pushing for territorial empire in favor of commercial wealth. And so from the Revolution of 1688-89 onwards, the English promoted a commercial society. They completely revised their tax codes to tax the landed and took taxes off of the manufacturing sector. They created a whole new set of financial institutions to revolutionize the economy and to provide investment into the manufacturing sector. But above all, the English state after 1688-89 was committed to the notion that the state needed to support manufacturing and that labor was the key to promoting prosperity, and that prosperity indeed was potentially infinite.
What prompted this shift from a landed society to a more commercial-based society? And did the English create any sort of new government institutions, aside from king and parliament, to help them govern this new society?
Absolutely. So the reason for the transformation was because later 17th century England was an incredibly commercially dynamic place. And the feeling was that among a number of people, a number of merchants, a number of manufacturers, et cetera, was that James II's preference for a landed society was restricting the possibility of English growth and meant inevitably that England was going to fall behind its continental competitors, not least because the continental competitors were far better endowed with land. And so they thought that the only possibility for England to compete on the world stage was for it to base its wealth on commerce and a commercial society. And the new institutions, the revolutionaries created, the touchstone of which was the creation of the Bank of England in 1694, which was not an accidental consequence of the revolution. It was part of the intention of the revolutionaries. And the argument was that this new Bank of England would shift liquidity, would shift capital from the relatively moribund landed sector and allow liquidity to circulate more readily within the manufacturing sector. And the bank, to help do this, provided low-interest loans to manufacturers. And this was the first national bank on this scale that did that gave interest on deposit and gave loans to manufacturing sector. So this is just one of the many institutions. But a second institution that the revolution created was the Board of Trade. And the Board of Trade was designed to oversee the entirety of the then English economy, including the empire itself. And the first head of the Board of Trade was John Locke, the political theorist. And the goal of the Board of Trade was to stimulate or support growth in the most dynamic sectors of the economy. And throughout the long 18th century, the most dynamic sectors of the English and then British economy were invariably the colonial area. So colonial trade and colonial growth was the most dynamic sector of the English economy for the long 17th and 18th centuries, which explains why the most controversial issues in British parliamentary debate from the 1690s onwards were always imperial issues. And indeed, from 1696, with the creation of the Board of Trade, England became an imperial state for the first time.
You know, we've heard historians bandy about this term, imperial state, but what did it mean to be an imperial state? And what sorts of issues did this new imperial state take up or debate?
What it means to be an imperial state is two things. The first was under Charles II and James II, the empire, that is to say, the colonies, but also England and Scotland, were ruled directly by the monarch. And while there had, famously been a Council of Trade and Plantations in the 1660s, 1670s, that council reported directly to the monarch and was not part of the state in any way. It was technically part of the royal household. But with the creation of the Board of Trade was responsible both to the Crown and to Parliament. And this meant from 1696 onwards, all issues having to do with the colonies could come before the English and then British Parliament, or Imperial Parliament, was created. And in fact, these issues did come on a regular basis before Parliament. And what kinds of issues were being debated? Well, issues having to do with trade, with governance, with the relationship between England and Scotland, England and Ireland, England and the colonies, and also foreign relations. And I think it's really important to notice that English historians have known for a long time that after 1688-89, legislation just skyrocketed. Up until this time, basically, the English Parliament passed very, very few laws, and most of those laws that it did pass were private bills. After the Revolution of 1688-89, for the first time, the English Parliament started legislating, passing huge numbers of laws, and most of those laws were on social and economic issues. And increasingly, we've come to understand that a very high percentage of those laws dealing with social and economic issues had to do with the colonies. So from the 1690s onward, there was hardly a period of salutary neglect, as we're often told in the textbooks. In fact, Parliament legislated regularly and frequently issues having to do with the colonies, both in terms of internal trade, or supporting the colonies in a variety of ways, providing bounties, providing subsidies, but also obviously regulating foreign trade. And I think it's really important to notice that, for example, in the period between 1728 and 1734, there was a whole spate of parliamentary legislation, which in fact ended up instantiating the institution of slavery in British North America and in the West Indies.
Okay, so now that we have an idea of the types of legislation that the English imperial government took up after the Glorious Revolution, what were the political factions like in Parliament? I mean, what principles did parliamentarians stand by and debate?
Let me just sort of take a step back. It's important to realize that because colonial trade, overseas trade, represented the most dynamic part of the British economy from the late 17th century onwards, of course that was going to be the issue that most people in Parliament were going to be most interested in. What could one do to promote this most dynamic part of the economy? What would be the best ways to harness this dynamic part of the economy to support the British government and the British state? And this, unsurprisingly, just like, the most dynamic areas of the 21st century economy are the ones which lead to most controversy in Congress, this led to the most controversy in the British Parliament. And from the 1720s onwards, there were two primary arguments associated with governing the empire. One was a set of arguments associated with the Prime Minister of the 1720s and 1730s, Sir Robert Walpole, and a group that I call the Establishment Whigs. And in their view, the key to promoting wealth was supporting production, and they were indifferent as to whether the labor that generated that production was free labor or unfree labor. All that was important was that work was getting done. And from the 1720s onwards, the Walpolean Whigs, or the establishment Whigs, argued that the most important part of this dynamic colonial economy were the slave colonies. In particular, they focused on the sugar colonies and slave production of sugar in the West Indies, but they were also happy to support slave-based rice production in South Carolina and slave-based tobacco production in the middle colonies. But in their view, the key to promoting wealth was supporting production. Now, their political opponents, the Patriot Whigs, who emerged in the 1720s, argued quite the opposite. They argued that the only way to promote a dynamic economy was to have a dynamic and creative interplay between producers and consumers. And because consumers played such a large role in their conceptualization, it was important that the labor that produced things be free labor, the people who were paid wages and hopefully high wages so that they can consume various products. So in the view of the Patriots, the key to British power and British wealth was manufactured goods, hopefully the increasing manufacturing sector in Britain itself. So they wanted, on the one hand, to pry open more markets for British manufactured goods. So the big prize for them was opening up markets to Spanish America, since Spanish America had increasingly become a silver-based economy where indigenous production of things like low-end cloth, etc., was being suppressed to drive indigenous peoples into the mines. And so there was almost, in their view, almost infinite demand for manufactured goods in Spanish America. So they wanted to open up Spanish American markets. British North American markets were also incredibly important because they understand quite well that British North America was growing at a tremendous rate demographically, and that British North Americans had virtually unlimited demand for British manufactured goods, for cloth, for textiles being produced in England, for things like silverware being produced in places like Sheffield, for nails being produced in Birmingham, et cetera, et cetera. So in their view, British North Americans were an incredible asset to the economy, especially an incredible asset in a period when European markets were being increasingly closed to British manufactured goods by people like the French and the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire, raising tariff barriers against British manufactured goods. So in that world, the best market, the most dynamic market, and the most guaranteed market for British manufacturers were in British North America. So they very much wanted to support the demographic growth of British North America. Whereas from the establishment Whig point of view, since production was the only thing that mattered, they prized much more the sugar colonies and those producing raw materials like rice and tobacco.
So it sounds like after the English Revolution, there were primarily two political parties in England. The Walpolean or establishment Whigs, who believed that labor, slave and free labor created national wealth, and the Patriot Whigs, who really wanted to see an interplay between producers and consumers. And the Patriot Whigs attempted to see this interplay by supporting policies that benefited free labor and increased the number of people who lived in the colonies. Because, after all, they believed that if you put people to work, especially in the colonies, then they'd have the money to buy goods, which would in turn expand the number of markets for English manufactured goods. These are really important political viewpoints to understand, and I wonder if you would help drive them home by telling us about the founding of Georgia. Because the colony started as a Patriot Whig experiment to prove their points about free labor and colonization, but it later became a colony that supported slavery, which seems to indicate that there was a political shift to the establishment Whig point of view about labor and wealth.
Right. So Georgia was founded in exactly the period of the sort of emergence of the Patriot Whigs. And the Georgia trustees included a number of leading Patriot Whigs, including James Edward Oglethorpe, but also James Vernon, whose younger brother Edward Vernon would play a significant role in the War of Jenkins' Ear, but also people like the Earl of Egmont. And it also, at the beginning, included some establishment Whigs, but it was very much a patriot program. And the idea of Georgia, to establish the new colony of Georgia, was that that would be a patriot model colony. So what do I mean by that? Since they believed that it was extremely important to have consumers, the trustees did two things that were sort of vital to their political economy. One was that they got the British Parliament to heavily subsidize immigration to the new colony, in the belief that it was very difficult for new immigrants to have startup costs to develop in a variety of ways. The British government not only paid for the immigrants to come to Georgia, but they also essentially gave them money to get things going for the first 2 years so that they wouldn't have to use their own money. But in a significant way, I think it's really important to realize that the colony of Georgia was a state-supported project. State-supported immigration was the heart of doing this. And of course, these new immigrants would immediately become great consumers of British manufactured goods. The second thing that they did was to outlaw slavery. So the first law of Georgia outlaws slavery because slaves could not be good consumers. And that kind of anti-slavery ideology seems to have been imbibed deeply by a number of the immigrants. In fact, that we know, for example, that the town of New Darien in Georgia sent a petition against slavery. So, and I should say, one of the other reasons, Georgia obviously was on the southern frontier, and one thing that's sort of insufficiently emphasized is that the idea of creating Georgia was in part to be able to penetrate Spanish American markets. Obviously, St. Augustine was nearby, but it was also very much hoped that the Atlantic ports of Georgia would make it easier to trade with Spanish America, and then hopefully that there would be development of Georgia towards the Gulf, which would, opening up Gulf ports, would also make it possible in the longer term to trade directly with Spanish America that way. Now, you asked a very good question. Why is it that the Patriot experiment in Georgia failed? Why eventually did it become a slave colony? Well, that has a lot to do with two factors. One was geopolitical, that Georgia was unfortunate in that it was founded just before the outbreak of what became the War of Jenkins' Ear and then became the world conflict that became the War of the Austrian Succession, or King George's War, if you will. And the result of that war was to make liquidity very tight, making it very difficult to get a new colony off the ground. And at the same time, there was significant pressure from a group of South Carolina merchants and investors in Georgia, many of whom happened to be slave traders, most prominently Sebastian Telfair, to make arguments on the streets of Savannah, but also to lobby various people, mostly Tories in London, arguing that Georgia could never survive without slavery. And that argument became increasingly plausible as Georgia failed to develop. And we now know that a large part of the reason why Georgia failed to develop, as many of the trustees has predicted, had a lot to do with the consequences of the War of the Austrian Succession. But in any event, it was the South Carolina slave trading group associated with Sebastian Telfair and a number of Scottish slave traders that successfully used Tory opposition to eliminate the law against slavery in Georgia. But it's important to realize that that patriot tradition in Georgia didn't die out, that in 1775 and 1776, when the Provincial Congress of Georgia, when the governor, James Wright, was captured and the patriots took over the governance of Georgia, they immediately petitioned for the end of the slave trade, recalling, in fact, the patriot roots of the foundation of the province and then the state.
You've given us a great understanding of the two dominant political ideologies in England during the 18th century. And we know that English ideas filtered out to the colonies, which the example of Georgia just demonstrated. So what political ideas prevailed in the other 12 British North American colonies? Did some colonies lean establishment Whig, touting that all labor creates wealth, while others lean Patriot Whig, promoting the idea that free labor promotes wealth?
Let me sort of take a big picture and then I'll try to answer the story in specifics. So just to sort of give you a kind of capsule or sort of an analogy, we know in 21st century America that there are things that we now call blue states and some states that we call red states. That is to say, some states that lean heavily Republican, some that lean heavily Democratic, and some that might be more hotly contested. But we also know that in the reddest of red states, there are some, Democrats, and in the bluest of blue states, there are some Republicans, that there's ideological debate, and those ideological debates, while there are, various local flavors to those debates, those ideological debates bear a strong resemblance to the national discussion. What differs by locality is the proportion of Republicans and Democrats, and that's a very good way to understand the debates throughout the British Empire. The debates that I'm describing were pan-imperial debates. They were reported in the press throughout the empire. The press, we now know, newspapers, for example, the Pennsylvania Gazette, routinely reprinted articles from various British newspapers. The same was true of the Kingston newspapers, the Halifax Gazette. Throughout the empire, there was a circulation of similar information and similar news stories. It turns out that in British North America, just like in Ireland and Scotland and the British West Indies, the press was overwhelmingly patriot rather than establishment Whig. There were establishment Whig newspapers and there were establishment Whig stories that got into the newspapers, and people were well aware of the debate, but the press tilted heavily in British North America, in the British West Indies, in Scotland and Ireland towards the Patriot rather than the establishment Whig point of view. And part of this is because Walpole's production strategy was also a heavily Anglo-centric strategy. At the same time that he was supporting the sugar colonies, he was also very much trying to shift the tax burden away from the landed gentlemen in England and onto the colonies, onto Scotland, onto Ireland, etc. And that, of course, meant in the perception of people in all of these places. Then it's also true that he was also trying to shift the burden onto the manufacturing sector to some degree in England, which meant that in all of those places, there was a natural kind of political tilt towards patriot arguments. Now, that said, it was obviously the case that many people in the West Indies, for example, felt that establishment Whig policies supporting sugar and slavery was supporting their wealth, and there was more substantial establishment Whig support in the West Indies than there would have been in, say, Massachusetts or Connecticut. Although I think it's important not to underestimate the degree of patriot support in Jamaica, for example, where elections were more heavily contested than any place else, and there was the serious Patriot Party. And again, it strikes me that things were more finely balanced in South Carolina, where a number of people, obviously rice planters, appreciated the new laws that the British Parliament had passed in the 1720s and 1730s to instantiate or to help support slavery. And here I'm referring not only to the Molasses Act, but also to the so-called Plantation Act, which tended to make it easier for slave owners to pay back debts using slaves as collateral. So, that was something which led to sort of a more finely balanced set of arguments in South Carolina, perhaps, than there would have been in Massachusetts or indeed in Nova Scotia. But I think it's important to realize that these debates and these ideas circulated widely through the press, and that it was a pan-imperial debate between patriot political economy and establishment Whig political economy.
Now that we have a sound idea, again, of all the political ideology and how it took shape on the ground in England and in her colonies, let's move into the Revolutionary era. The French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, ended in 1763. And Steve notes in the heart of the Declaration that after the war, Great Britain, France, and Spain all sought ways to earn money to pay down their national debts and to rebuild their armies and navies. Steve, would you tell us about this post-war period and the policies that each empire pursued to rebuild after the war?
Yeah, the 7 Years' War, like the War of the Spanish Succession, that is to say Queen Anne's War, and like King George's War, created a massive national debt for all of the European empires. Only the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War created an even larger debt of unprecedented scale. And this provoked debates in the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire about how to repay this massive debt. And the contours of the debate about what to do about a massive national debt will seem very familiar to us. The arguments that, we're still repeating today were laid out in the 18th century. Basically, one group of people said, well, the best way to pay down the debt is to stop spending money, to pursue austerity measures, and to levy heavier taxes on those who were least able to resist in a variety of ways. So it meant levying heavier taxes on the colonies. So that was one set of arguments, and there was another set of arguments that were advanced at this point by patriots in Britain, but also these kind of arguments were also levied in the French and Spanish empires, was that no, in fact, the colonies are the most dynamic part of all of these imperial economies. The worst thing you could possibly do is tax the most dynamic sector of the economy, and the best way to pay down the debt was to try to stimulate economic growth and thereby increasing customs revenue, increasing income from various sales taxes. That is to say, when consumers bought more goods, they would generate more tax revenue, and that would be the best and surest way to pay down the debt. And this was an argument that took place in all three empires. And I should say it's an argument which took place not only in Europe, but also took place in all of the colonies. And I guess one thing I wanted to sort of make clear that I might not have emphasized earlier is that the various political economic arguments were not political economic arguments which developed by a few smart guys sitting in London, Paris, or Madrid. These were arguments which were developed in many cases based on arguments or observations taking place on the ground in places like Charleston, South Carolina, or Kingston, Jamaica, or Halifax, Nova Scotia, or in Bombay, Madras, Calcutta in the case of the British Empire. And in the case of the French Empire, we know increasingly that a lot of the arguments were developed by people on the ground in the French West Indies, for example. And again, the same in the Spanish Empire. We know a lot of these ideas, these political information was coming from the colonies, and so that one shouldn't see these ideas as being imposed from Europe onto the colonies. These were things that were developed mutually and through a set of negotiations and circulation of a wide range of information on both sides of the Atlantic.
As we continue to contextualize the American Revolution by looking at the politics and events that happened before and around it, we should also look at the larger context of some of the Revolution's more famous events, like the Stamp Act riots of 1765. In the United States, we learn that the Stamp Act riots were exceptional acts of protest against British imperial authority. But Steve sees these riots very differently. Steve, would you tell us why you don't think that the North American Stamp Act riots were exceptional events?
So one of the things that I was sort of struck by was, even at the time, even looking at colonial newspapers, was how people were extremely well aware that there was resistance to the kinds of austerity measures that were being adopted in the French Empire, in the Spanish Empire, as well as in the British Empire. So let me just sort of tell you a little bit about them. So in the Spanish Empire, the Spanish Prime Minister, the Marquis de Esquilache, instituted a series of austerity measures and reforms, not only in Spain itself, but also throughout the Spanish Empire. And we know that this led to resistance in a variety of areas. We know it led to some resistance in Puebla and Mexico, but spectacularly in Quito, there was an uprising of over 100,000 people that at least temporarily kicked out Spanish government in the 1760s, reacting against the sort of austerity measures that Grenville was imposing in Britain and in colonial North America. And in Spain itself, there was a massive riot against Esquilache's austerity measures called the Motín de Esquilache. And it was such a powerful revolt, and throughout Spain, but most powerfully in Madrid, that the king was only able to regain control of Madrid, which was a city of about 100,000 people at the time, by occupying the city with 25,000 Walloon troops. So that's one soldier for every 4 citizens in Madrid. So you can sort of see that this was an extremely powerful uprising. In fact, as a proportion of the population, more people seem to have been involved in both in the uprising in Quito and the Motín de Esquilache than took place in the Stamp Act riots in British North America. But this wasn't all. The Duc de Choiseul, the leading minister in France, also pursued austerity measures. In the French West Indies, we know it led to significant unrest, for example, in Saint-Domingue and in Martinique, leading eventually to the departure of the governor of Saint-Domingue. But in France, these austerity measures led to what was called the Parlementaire Revolt, where the various local judiciaries refused to simply register the new taxes that Choiseul wanted to impose, which made it impossible to collect them. So again, in the French Empire, these austerity measures led to significant resistance. And we shouldn't underestimate the amount of resistance in Britain itself to the British Prime Minister George Grenville's policies. There were massive riots in Spitalfields in London. There was serious civil unrest. There were petitions throughout the country complaining about Grenville's austerity measures. And again, unsurprisingly, most heavily in the manufacturing sectors. And there was also significant murmuring, although not yet political unrest, in both Scotland and Ireland. So the point which I'm trying to make is that the Stamp Act riots were a local manifestation of, in fact, a global phenomenon, a global response to a set of austerity measures which were adopted at the end of the 7 Years' War to try to pay down the debt. And the important thing to understand is that these austerity measures were not inevitable. It's frequently depicted in the literature, both about British North America, but about these European empires as well, that they had no choice other than to pursue these austerity measures. Well, we know with respect to both the French and Spanish empires that this wasn't the case, because in both cases, the governments responded to the unrest by pulling back. So in the French case, they moved from a position of sort of very strict regulation of French colonial trade, the so-called exclusif, to the exclusif mitigé, which led to some modicum of a freer trade. And in the case of Spanish America, we know that the response to the rebellion in Quito and many of these concerns was also to allow, at least for intra-imperial free trade, for the first time in the Spanish Empire. So in both those cases, there was kind of a rethinking of the kinds of imperial policies that could be pursued. And in the case of Britain, the point which I try to make in the book is that under the Patriot governments which had been governing Britain until the accession of George III, the Patriots had not wanted at all to tax the colonies directly. In fact, they've been providing bounties to support colonial economic development. They continued to subsidize immigration to North America, and the Patriots had felt that the worst thing you could possibly do is tax the most dynamic sectors of the economy. So when George Grenville came into power and adopted these austerity measures, it marked a 180-degree reversal of the kinds of economic policies towards the empire which the British had been pursuing. And I guess this might be the point to say something about what we know about expenditures on the empire. So in some recent work that I did with the University of Chicago economist and political scientist Jim Robinson, we've looked comparatively at how European governments in the 18th century spent their revenue. And it turns out that there's a group of European states, including Russia and the Holy Roman Empire, that spent over 90% of their revenue on warfare or preparing for war. And then there are another group of European states, like France and the Dutch Republic, that spent about 80% of their revenue on warfare and 20% on other things. But Britain, until the 1760s, spent only 65% of its revenue on warfare. Now, 65% is a lot, but that let, a huge increment to be spent on other things. And our analysis suggests that, in fact, the British state spent that increment, that 15% more revenue than France or the Dutch Republic, on colonial development, on building infrastructure in the colonies and Scotland and Ireland, and providing disaster relief. So when Charleston, South Carolina burned to the ground in 1740, the British government provided a huge amount of money to rebuild Charleston. And this was something that set the British government before 1760 apart from its European competitors. And George Grenville tried very much to bring Britain's expenditures into line with the kinds of spending policies of France. And this, provided a huge shock to people in Ireland and Scotland, but above all to British North America.
Okay, I think we can see how all these differing viewpoints about how Great Britain should pay off its war debt contributed to the foment of the American Revolution. So let's get to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence and its purpose. Now, many historians and textbooks claim that the American Revolution was a quest by Americans to seek a smaller, more local government than the British Empire provided. But Steve, in the heart of the Declaration, you claim that this wasn't really the case. You claim that the founders actually sought a more activist government than the empire provided. Would you tell us why you think the founders sought an activist government rather than the smaller, more local government that we've learned about?
To understand the context of the Declaration of Independence, one has to understand exactly that up until the accession of George III, the British government spent more money on colonial development than its imperial rivals. And with the accession of George III, there was a huge turning point, a turn away from making that kind of expenditures. And that's why the Declaration emphasizes not that the British Empire had been a problem for North Americans from time out of mind, but that from the accession of George III, the British government started doing bad things. And so it's really important to understand that the Patriots understood that there was a complete reversal of British imperial policy at the accession of George III. And in particular, I point out in the book, the Patriots complained in the Declaration of Independence that George III's government, for example, had made it much more difficult to immigrate to North America, that all sorts of inhibitions were placed on immigration. And in particular, the Declaration notes that George III had stopped the subsidies to support immigration, which had been offered on and off in substantial ways throughout the 18th century before then. So that's one element. So the authors of the Declaration of Independence complained that the British state had stopped supporting immigration. The second thing is that the authors of the Declaration complained that the British state had stopped supporting trade into Spanish America and French America. This was a specific complaint in the Declaration. So in a very real sense, the founders wanted to support freer trade. But it's important to understand what freer trade meant in the 18th century. It didn't mean that the state needed to get out of commerce and sort of pull back and let the free market work. It meant very much because Britain's imperial rivals like France and Spain closed their ports to British American merchants. It meant the state needed to support with its navy those who wanted to trade in French and Spanish markets. So it meant support and protection of trade in a significant way. And they complained that George III had stopped doing that. I also point out that in the first complaint about George III, the authors of the Declaration complained that George had vetoed important legislation. And it strikes me as almost certain that the legislation that they complained about George III having vetoed were the prohibitive slave duties that a number of colonies up and down in British North America, but also in the British West Indies, had passed only to have them vetoed by the Board of Trade. And we know actually how often this happened from the 1720s onwards. We know, for example, in the 1720s when the Jamaican Assembly passed prohibitive slave duties and limits on the number of slaves, we know that this led to mass petitioning campaign in places like Liverpool and Bristol, which led the Board of Trade to veto this legislation that had been passed by the Assembly. But this, in the late 1760s and 1770s, this veto power had been used over and over and over again. And so in that sense, I also think that the Declaration was sort of calling on the state to be more active in preventing the slave trade. But I think above all, the sort of clinching point from my point of view is that the concluding clauses of the Declaration, and that the only clauses that John Adams quoted to his wife in celebrating the Declaration, were the clauses about establishing a government. And just to put this in historical context, from 1775 onwards, certainly after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, nobody on either side of the Atlantic doubted that North America was de facto independent. So this was the claim that George III made, and George III simply argued that we, the British, need to reconquer North America. And the position that most North Americans took was that, in fact, imperial government and local government, to many degrees, had ceased to function in North America. So there was no real need to say that North America was independent. Everybody sort of acknowledged that, in fact, North America was independent in 1775. What was important was to create a state that would guarantee that independency. And it's extremely important to realize that from a European perspective, that is to say, from the perspective of the Spanish and the French, there was no way that they were going to support an insurrection by North Americans against Britain for two reasons. One was, if an insurrection without a state, there was no guarantee that they simply wouldn't reconcile with the British. And the second reason was, if they supported an insurrection, then that would set a precedent for insurrection against their own colonies. So it was absolutely essential that the Declaration of Independence not just declare independence, but declare and create a state. And because the founders and because the members of the Second Continental Congress, their fundamental concern had been that the British government had stopped doing all of the things that it had been doing prior to the accession of George III to promote colonial development. What they wanted was not less of a state, but they wanted to create a state that was going to be able to do things that the British state used to do but stopped doing with the accession of George III.
Would you tell us about the passages in the Declaration that you just mentioned? You noted that John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail about the last couple of paragraphs in the Declaration and how they allowed Congress to create a new government. Would you tell us about these passages and how they laid out a blueprint for an activist government?
What those paragraphs emphasize was, what many people have pointed out, that it was important that the Declaration of Independence created a government which could, make war, make peace, raise an army, et cetera, but it also insisted that this government establish commerce, not allow commerce, establish commerce. And that strikes me as exactly sort of taking on the language that patriots had been adopting on both sides of the Atlantic from the 1720s, that it was the role of the government, the role of the state, to promote commerce, to promote trade, to promote the welfare of the people. And that's what's in those last couple of paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. It's saying that we, by this act, are creating this kind of government. Now, absolutely, Adams believed that it wasn't going to be the Declaration of of Independence alone that was going to do this. He believed that there was going to be a revolutionary portfolio. That is to say that a Declaration of Independence needed to go along with the Model Commercial Treaty, which was going to support freer trade with whoever would sign on to it, that went along with establishing the state constitutions and went along with creating the Articles of Confederation. But the Declaration of Independence was very much a document about creating a state that could now act in the world of other states. And I think it was really important to establish this state, that it was a state that one could lend money to, because otherwise, without a state, without that kind of a state, why would any European, either private actors or government, lend money to support this rebellion against, what was the most powerful empire in the world, if there was nobody to whom they could demand that these loans be paid back?
Steve, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence over 240 years ago. So why do you think it's really important for us today to explore the possibilities that the founders' true intent for the document was to create an activist government?
So in my view, the kinds of issues which 18th century governments faced, many of the issues were the same issues that we're wrestling with today. And why is this? Well, it's because, in essence, with the emergence of states in the 17th and 18th century began, to my mind, the modern era. And the fundamental problems of the modern era involve problems like how best to pay down a national debt, how best to promote economic growth in your country, what should be your attitudes towards immigrants, should you invite them in, should you keep them out? Should you have many classes of citizens, or should everybody participate on an equal basis? And again, whether you should be promoting freer trade or should be pursuing tariff barriers, these strike me as the same issues, the same debates that we're having in the 21st century. And the reason why they're the same debates, or at least the same family of debates, is because, in fact, in the 18th century, modern states emerged. And it strikes me that the Declaration of Independence, as our founding document, created this country on certain principles of what kind of a state, or what kinds of answers to those questions we should adopt. We should be a pro-immigrant state. We should be a polity which believes the state should be activist to promote economic growth. So, to my mind, the Declaration of Independence is the single most important of the founding documents, because it founded the American state, and it should be a point of reference for us today. And it should be a point of reference to us today precisely because so many of the issues that our founders were wrestling with are issues which are resonant today.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
There are two ways to look at the Declaration of Independence. One would be as a document that unmade the British Empire by declaring the United States a free and independent nation. Another way is to look at it in the ways that we've been talking about, as a document that creates a government. So, Steve, in your opinion, what would have happened if the Declaration of Independence had just been a document that had simply unmade the British Empire? How would the course of United States and British history be different?
Well, I think it would have been fundamentally different, and it would have been fundamentally different for two reasons. The first is, I think it would have been extremely hard to imagine a French alliance. Now, we know that the French government hated the British, and they were perfectly willing to be gadflies, doing anything to hurt the British Empire. And that meant that they were perfectly willing to wink at illicitly supplying, gunpowder or guns to the American colonies. But there's no way that the French would have signed an alliance, which they did with the Americans during the Revolutionary War, had there not been an American state with which to ally to. And we know this from not only because of their reticence to do this beforehand, but we know this because those of us who have worked in the French archives have found many documents saying explicitly that the French would not have formed the alliance, they would not have provided the military support, they would not have provided the naval support that was so vital in securing the victory at Yorktown, had the Americans not created a state in 1776. And it wasn't just a question of recognition. It was, from their point of view, they needed to create a state which had the wherewithal to protect the various contractual agreements involved in making an alliance. So had the Declaration of Independence not created a state, there would not have been a French alliance. And we know this extremely well from documents in the French archives. The second thing is, I think, had a state not been created, it's possible and indeed likely that the American situation would have been much more analogous to the Irish situation. So in the 1770s in Ireland, just as in North America, there was significant discontent with the policies that the Grenville and the North government had adopted. There was an extremely powerful extra-governmental movement called the Volunteer Movement, which created and in fact shadow governments throughout Ireland. It put pressure on the Irish Parliament. The Irish Parliament in 1782, 1783 declared legislative independence from Britain. But that's all it did. It didn't create any kind of an independent state. And that led essentially to the renegotiations of the terms of the empire in 1782, 1783, 1784 with Britain. And as we know, Ireland remained part of the British Empire until the 20th century. By the Declaration of Independence, creating a state made it impossible both for those who were lukewarm in the cause, people like John Dickinson, for example, to move backwards towards supporting various forms of reconciliation, but it also made it much, much harder for the British to imagine some kind of reconciliation. And to be perfectly honest, it also made it much easier for the American government to borrow money, to raise money, to print money, to coin money, to raise taxes, et cetera, to fight the war. And I think that would have been much, much more difficult without a state. It would have been impossible. So I think one would want to think seriously that had there not been a Declaration of Independence creating an American state, I think there was a real possibility that North America would have gone the route of Ireland and sort of perhaps renegotiated the terms of the imperial arrangement, but not created a new government or a new state.
Now that you've gotten to the heart of the Declaration of Independence, what are you researching and writing about now?
Well, this book is kind of an outgrowth of a book that I've been working on for about 15 years on the British Empire from 1650 to 1784. So I'm going to continue to work on that. And that research has, led me to archives in, I think, now 16 different countries. And so that's a big project that I've written large parts of it, about 800 pages of it. But I'm also toying with the idea and have started work on a project on setting the American Revolution in global context, placing it alongside and in the context of developments around the world, but outside of Britain and its empire, but also in the context of things like British Bengal and the British West Indies more generally, and also British aspirations moving east. So I'm writing that book on the global context of the British Empire, but also returning to the global context of the American Revolution, trying to understand the American Revolution less as an exceptional event and trying to really place it back in the context of the Age of Revolutions by thinking about that Age of Revolutions not as somebody like Palmer did as narrowly European event, but as kind of a global event. So that's one project, and then the other project is this larger project on the British Empire.
And how can we get in contact with you if we still have questions about the Declaration of Independence and the global context of the American Revolution?
So you can email me at stephen.pincus@yale.edu. You can find information about me on my Yale University History Department website.
Steve Pincus, thank you for helping us better understand the global and political contexts of the American Revolution and for helping us glimpse the heart of the Declaration of Independence.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. This has been a delightful conversation.
Our conversation with Steve has me rethinking how I look at and understand the Declaration of Independence. Like Steve, I believe the Declaration was necessary to secure foreign aid for the war. I mean, France, Spain, and the Netherlands did not want to provide financial support to colonies that might go back to Great Britain, nor did they want to fund 13 independent nations. So the Declaration of Independence was necessary to prove to these foreign powers that the states were serious about being independent and about forming an independent government. But does the document also lay out the founders' intention to form an activist government? This is a timely question for me, because I'm presently researching the Articles of Confederation and how the Second Continental Congress drafted them and how the states ratified them. Now, I've gone ahead and pulled out my copy of the Declaration of Independence to reread that last paragraph. And the last paragraph begins by restating most of Richard Henry Lee's resolution from June 7, 1776, that these United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And after restating this part of the resolution, it absolves the colonies from all allegiance to the British Crown. And then the declaration reads as follows: and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Steve is right. These lines list powers of government and gives those powers to the newly independent states. Now, does it also lay out a blueprint for an activist government? As Steve pointed out, it's all in how you read the context of the Declaration's drafting. And to see the activist government, Steve advises us to go back and to try and understand the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. Now, I don't know about you, but these are ideas that I need to think about more. For more information about Steve, his book, The Heart of the Declaration, plus notes for everything we talked about today, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/119. Cornell University Press is now accepting pre-orders for its new paperback edition of Ninigret, Sachem of the Niantics and Narragansetts. If discovering more about Eastern Native American peoples and their interactions with colonial settlers interests you, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell for more information about this book. And be sure to use your special promo code while you're there, 09BFW. You'll save 30% off this pre-order and on other early American history books from Cornell University Press. Finally, what do you think about the idea that the founders sought to establish an activist government? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.